Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to Cat's Eye on the Future. Tonight, we have the return of our very special guest, Kveldulfr Gundarsson. And last time, we talked about the runes, and you gave a lot of really good explanation, basically on runes and runic divination. But you also mentioned how it's important to know some of the background of the generic world and the cosmology. And what we're going to talk about today is a little bit different. I thought it would be kind of fun as we went into the fall season. It's not quite October yet, but we're heading in that direction. And to talk about the beings, spirits, things that people encountered, or at least, are supposed to encounter in the Germanic Otherworld or Overworld, or however you want to think of it. And with that, I'm going to say, perhaps you would like to talk about in the beginning, just give us kind of a hint as to what may be out there.
Okay, a hint as to what may be out there. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that we tend to like making very tidy, neat separations of otherworldly beings into different categories. Land wights, elves, gods, giants. Our ancestors didn't think that way. It's very hard to find clear dividing lines in the otherworld at all. The progression, for instance, from a dead person, a ghost, to possibly an elf, to possibly a housewight like the Tomta or Nissa or whatever you want to call him, depending on what part of Scandinavia you're from, or even all the way up to an actual god, what is listed in the lists of the Aesir. We can track that progression. We have examples from every stage of it. If we look at some of the terminology that's used, we have this term Aesir, which refers to a particular tribe of gods, Odin and Thor. Everyone knows this. But then we get the singular of the same word, Aus. One Aus plus one Aus equals two Aesir. And we get this same word used for some of the bigger and more powerful local giants. For instance, the Svinefjordsaus, who's mentioned in Njal's saga briefly, obviously as a great land wight, is a giant of some sort, but he's the Aus of Svinefjord. If there were two of them, they'd be the Aesir of Svinefjord. The same thing with Barther Snæfellsaus. Again, he's a giant. He's got his own saga, and he's the son of the king of the giants in Norway, and there's a revolution, and he has to flee to Iceland. And he makes his home in this mountain, Snæfell, and he's the Aus of Snæfell. So it's a fuzzy thing, so understand that I'm still going to be using the different category terms for convenience, and our forebears used all of these terms. And the best you can say about them is that mostly they seem to differentiate in power level and how friendly they are to humans, but just keep in mind that these are not hard and fast separations. A being can very easily slip from one category to another. So I'll start with the wights that our forebears probably spent the most time with, what we call the land wights. And if you're a Roman, you might call one of these, you might say genus locus or genus loci. Not really sure about the Latin, sorry about that. But the spirit of the place. The local spirit, who is part of the land, is an embodiment of the land that you make offerings to, and they help you out in various ways. In one of the early Icelandic sagas, there's a guy who makes friends with one of these that appears to him in the form of a mountain dweller, a troll or small ettin of some sort, and goes out with him fishing, helps him fish, helps his herd of goats thrive, helps his harvest thrive, does everything with him. And the terminology used for the relationship is actually very much the terminology you'd use for a business partner. The man and his local land wight that lives on his farm, they're partners. There's another guy in a later saga in the Flateyjarbók collection who has a local land wight who lives in a stone on his land, as is typical of land wights and elves, and If you ever find a really clear distinction between them, let me know. I'd be delighted to hear it. I don't think there actually was one. But this guy used two terms to refer to his local land wight. He called him his Armather, his harvest man, harvest person, really, and he called him his Spoumather, his prophecy man, or really prophecy person, which also implies that this wight had the dual activities of helping him with his harvest, with his fruitfulness. They kind of tended the land together again, and was also a giver of advice, a giver of prophecy. You know, maybe the Spoumather told him, look, don't plant just yet, we're going to have a late freeze. Maybe he was able to tell him more extensive things. You know, don't get involved in this feud, it won't end well for you. We don't know for sure, but there was some sort of advice giving, some sort of prophecy going on there. And the belief in the land wights stayed particularly strong in Iceland, where the land wights are actually responsible for having headed off an invasion. One of the kings of Denmark had the great idea, I'll go and invade Iceland, but, you know, being a very intelligent king, which was why he had already been successful enough to think about this, he hired a wizard. I can't remember I think it may actually have been a Sami wizard, I'm not sure, but he hired a wizard who went out of his body in the form of a whale and swam to Iceland to check it out, to see how powerful the land wights were going to be there. And the whale swam around the island, made a try at it at each quarter, and at each quarter there was a great wight in a different form, with a horde of smaller wights of the same form that came down to drive him off. There was a giant with a horde of giants or trolls. There was an eagle with a bunch of lesser birds. I think a bull, forget what the fourth one was, but they were the guardians of the four parts of Iceland, and they actually defended it. And very similarly, Icelandic law, early Icelandic law said if you are approaching friendly territory with one of those head prows with gaping jaws, take it down before you get within sight of land, because it will upset the land wights. It will stir them up, and bad things will happen. In Eyjolf's saga, we actually see this happening. Eyjolf wants to drive King Eric Bloodaxe and his queen Gunhild out of Norway, and he's one guy who lives in Iceland, you know, has just lost his inheritance in Norway because of legal manipulations. He doesn't have a lot of direct power. As one man, he doesn't really himself have, I suspect, the power to shift the weird of a whole country. So what he does is he puts up this knighting pole, and people often talk about him putting it up against Eric and Gunhild, but that's not what happened. He put it up against the land wights. He pointed it at the land wights so they'd have no peace until they chased them out. And it worked. It actually worked. Eric and Gunhild got driven out of Norway, ended up in England. Very, very effective there.
Knighting pole, that sounds familiar. Can you explain to my listeners what that is? And I seem to recall something about it being used in modern Iceland recently.
Yes, knighting pole, it literally means pole of insult or pole of shame. And it was put up when you wanted to direct bad thoughts, bad feeling, and bad mojo at someone or something. The most common version is something like what Eyjolf did, with a horse's head on a pole and possibly a runic inscription, a rune carved on the pole in rune staves, and chanted. There's also examples in the sagas, which aren't quite as family friendly. Sometimes they seem to be used just to make a particularly strong point that somebody is really disliked. And there's one case where a pole was set up with the two targets, one of them actually, having anal intercourse with the other. The shame being particularly with the sort of macho view on the recipient. There doesn't seem to have been a lot of stigma attached to being the active partner. But it's, the modern Icelanders have occasionally taken to use this as a gesture, of extreme disapproval. I believe, if I recall correctly, Sveinbjörn, God's bless him, guy who founded Modern House of Crew in Iceland, and his crew set up one at one of the major world conferences against them who would use nuclear weapons. And this was their way of saying, don't.
I also believe that recently, in 2008, with the economic collapse, that there were protesters that set up knifing poles in front of the Icelandic banks and the parliament. And I think that's the most recent use I remember seeing in the newspapers.
They probably did, and the message was the same. The message was, we think you suck.
And it looks
and we want bad stuff to happen to you. And again, it looks like it's worked pretty well.
I was going to say, I'd say that's a fairly successful use, but that would actually be more of magic rather than communication. Or is it both?
I think really it's more magic. Aelts was an example of communication because he was pointing it at the land whites, again, because they would have, he could affect the land whites, they could affect Eric and Gunhild, but it's my theory that he knew he couldn't affect Eric and Gunhild himself. So really what that's an example of is something you see a lot in Norse magic, which is asking, compelling, or invoking otherworldly whites to help with your magic. You see this a lot in healing. There's some very interesting healing inscriptions or charms that have survived, like the Canterbury charm, where the infected wound, the fever in the infected wound, if you like, and I do, the bacteria that have infected that wound, are identified as a giant with a particular name, Gyril or Kirill, and Thor is called on in the charm to drive this white out, to drive the fever white out. So you're basically identifying the problem as one otherworldly being. You're calling another otherworldly being whose provenance it most distinctly is to deal with beings of the Etenkin, the Thirstkin, who molest humans or gods, and you're calling this being to drive out the other being. And this is a pretty common motif in Norse healing magic.
Getting back to the land whites for just a second, some of what you described earlier, I think a lot of my listeners might recognize from a sort of more modern New Age perspective as being sort of like a spirit guide, but one who's more tied to the land necessarily than to the person, or would that be correct?
It's very, very much tied to the land. This might actually be one of the few distinctions or possible distinctions between land whites and the elves, because land whites are very much tied to the land, but we have some accounts of elves migrating. Most of the time it's a temporary migration from summer home to winter home. But you also see them setting sail for Iceland, or from Denmark to Norway. Who knows, maybe even to Finland. I'm not sure it's recorded, but they may well have done.
Well, actually, weren't there advertisements in newspapers and things from the 19th century?
There was a Well, that was a house white. Now, house whites are a different kettle of fish altogether.
Okay, so they're not land whites. They're not the same thing.
They would not be the same thing as land whites. Land whites probably were never human. Elves may or may not have been. It may depend on the individual elf. It may depend on something we don't know about elves and where they come from. Some elves sometimes were definitely human. Some elves sometimes don't seem to ever have been. House whites, the best guess we have is that the Tanta or Nissa or whatever you want to call him, was the original settler buried on the farm back in the Stone Age in his little mound. And he continued to be worshipped, became the guardian of the land and his descendants on the land. And sometimes the house white will stay with the house, but often enough, and you see this in the Celtic as well with some of the brownie stories, often enough the house white will pack up and move along with his family when they moved. He's a little more closely tied to the family than the stead, but back in the day, you couldn't distinguish the two. The advertisement that you were talking about there, I think it was a Canadian newspaper, it was 19th century, and Icelandic family that had just immigrated to Canada put an advertisement in an Icelandic newspaper saying, does anyone have a female white who would be willing to move? Our own fellow came with us and he's getting lonely.
So basically they were looking for a companion
They were looking for a companion for their housewhite.
So are there any other obvious differences between land whites and housewhites?
Housewhites tend to appear in characteristic shapes, and anyone who's grew up in a Scandinavian family or has been to a Scandinavian country, particularly around Ewell, knows exactly what these guys look like. They're little fellas. They tend to be older, tend to be beardy. They often wear gray jackets, but they're dressed in what you'd think of as kind of 18th, 19th century peasant garb, and they've got these little pointy hats on them. Usually it's a red hat. Some versions, some areas it's a gray hat, but they've got these little peaky hats and they're little tiny guys, and that's always what they look like. Whereas land whites can look like just about anything they please. Each land white seems to have its preferred form, but they can be anything from, a troll to an eagle or bull, whatever.
And how do you keep both land whites and house whites happy if you have them, or how would you learn to recognize them in your home or your apartment in New York City?
Okay, well, house whites, happily, there's a lot of very specific lore on how you keep the house white happy. He wants his porridge with his lump of butter in it every Thursday. He wants his snops and his pouch of tobacco at Yule or New Year's. He wants you to at least make a slight effort to pick up after yourself, because they're very hard workers and they don't approve of people being lazy. And then there's a couple of little things like you don't ever give him a full suit of clothes all at one go. There's a lot of stories about people, and again, these are common to the Celtic as well. You also see them in a lot of the Celtic lore, as well as the Scandinavian. There's all these stories about people who see their house white and he's looking pretty tatty, and they think, oh, the poor fella, he's been working so hard for us, he's such a good guy, I should give him a set of new clothes. And they give him a set of new clothes and he puts them on, and he's so spiffy and proud that he just doesn't want to work anymore and muck up his lovely new clothes. So if you're going to give him clothes, only one piece at a time. I actually have a little statue that I got in Sweden. Someone doing traditional crafts made up these little tomte figures, and every so often he gets ragged and I have to replace his clothes, but only one piece at a time.
I remember the last time we were doing that, or one of the times we were doing that, and a friend from Sweden was helping me sew clothing, and she was very careful not to make a complete set.
Yeah.
She mentioned that also, and she's, as far as I know, not Ossetru or anything. This is just Swedish folklore that everybody there seems to know.
Yeah, but his porridge and his butter on Thursdays, his spirits and pouch of tobacco at Yule.
Now, are housewhites ever mischievous in sort of the way that, say, I hate to use this term, but like leprechauns might be traditionally in Irish folklore?
Yes, they can be. The thing is, you don't want to upset them. You really, really do not want to upset the housewhite, because they're little guys, but they're very strong, and they take offense very easily. They don't tend to mess stuff up. They don't tend to be mischievous unless they're annoyed about something, at which point you'd want to find out what they're doing. They will occasionally do things if you have two animals of the same sort, both healthy, and one of them is constantly getting fatter and one is constantly thin. Sometimes that means that the housewhite likes one of them better than the other. There's stories about them nicking the fodder out of the stall of the horse that they don't like as much to give it to the horse that they do like better. But generally when they act up, it's because they've been offended. And generally the results like that are pretty dire, being translated as the person who did it is horribly killed by the housewhite.
Okay.
Because they are perfectly capable of picking a grown man up and chucking him over the house. Or picking him up by the ankles and beating him to death against the barn walls, or shoving him into a forging oven, There's one story about that where a guy messed with the housewife's butter, and the housewife got ticked off and shoved him into the forging iron oven. And this was an interesting one because that housewife wasn't actually a family wife. He lived in a foundry. Housewives tend to have a lot higher tolerance for iron than a lot of other worldly beings. And this housewife, he looked after the foundry, and one of the apprentices thought he'd play a trick or do something nasty in the housewife's bowl or whatever. The housewife said, "Enough of you," shoved him into the oven, clang, stoke up the forge.
So you heard it here first, folks. Be nice to your housewives. You won't like it if you're not.
And don't mess with their weekly butter. They like their butter, and if you try to play a trick by hiding it under it, or if you steal some of it for yourself or anything like that, they really, really, really don't take well to that.
But what about land whites? Are there ways to give them offerings or talk to them?
Generally, land whites typically received offerings, and those would typically be offerings of food and drink. I'm hard put to think of any examples of specific animal sacrifice to land whites, unlike the elves who do receive it fit. It's more common to leave food out for them, leave drink out for them. You can do that with almost any other worldly white, and it will be appreciated, but it's particularly common with land whites. And as for getting to talk to them, some of that depends on your own capability to feel or interact with whites of the other world, your own ability to perceive. Often they'll come to people in dreams, again, the same way elves or gods or the dead or pretty much anyone will. Some people have clearer sight, clearer hearing than others, and actually can perceive them communicating. But even if you're not so good at, picking up signals from the other world, still a good idea to just go out and sit there, touch the dirt, or sit by the natural feature. They're often associated with streams, waterfalls, special trees, special stones, particularly earth-fast stones, which are stones that go all the way down. And sit there, make the offering, just talk to them, introduce yourself, express your respect for them, say something nice about the land that is their care. If you're not much of a perceiver, let them know that they're welcome to have a word with you in your dreams. And, there's also a number of other magical things you can do to enhance the communications process, but that's, that at that point you're moving into specific rituals for doing that, which is a bit out of our scope today.
And kind of finally, are they kind of like, I don't know, the kind of New Age idea of divas, and like there might be a land white, but it could be just something like a stream or a creek or a particular tree or a rock or just kind of anything in nature?
Yes.
Okay.
In a word, yes.
In a word. Fantastic. Okay, let's move along a little bit to the elves.
Actually, I should probably say something else about land whites, which is that there really, really seems to be no distinguishing point between land whites and giants. And in fact, the most unpersonalized, most aggressive, just generic embodiment of total planetary destruction, Surtur, remained, as far as we can tell, sort of an abstract until the Norse got to Iceland, which is volcanic, and they realized, Surtur lives here, right here, under the lava fields, in the hot lava below our very island, and he is the last being in the world that I would ever have thought that our ancestors would have shown any sign of worship to. But in the earliest Icelandic accounts, there's already a guy going down to Surtur's cave, where Surtur is known to live, with a praise poem for him. Now, we don't know what the guy had in mind. Was he asking Surtur to please do not cover my house in molten lava? Was he saying, my neighbor's a jerk, please cover his farm with molten lava? Was he saying, thank you, Surtur, for dumping your molten lava over there and not on my house? Was it just a general expression of respect in the sense of, we've got to live with this guy? Who knows?
So that's a good segue, actually. Maybe instead of elves, then next we should just go ahead and do giants.
Yeah.
Because you've already started in that direction.
I've already started on giants. And what do we know about giants? Well, first we know they're all descended from the proto-giant, proto-Etin, Ymir, one of the two first living beings in the universe, killed by Odin and his brothers, made the earth out of his body, sea out of his blood, dome of the sky out of his skull, etc. Now, being descended from Ymir is no particular distinction, because everyone is, except possibly the Vanir. We don't know where they came from. Humans are descended from Ymir two ways. We were shaped out of trees, which were made from his hairs, according to the tales, and we're also descended from the gods, who, as I said, except for the Vanir, they're all descended from Ymir.
So gods and giants are the same?
Gods and giants are basically the same family. The only difference is, first were Ymir and Aldumla, the cow who fed him. Aldumla licked a third being kind of spontaneously generated out of the ice of Niflheimr. And this being either married a giant girl and had a son, or possibly was like Ymir, hermaphroditic, and produced a son. The son married a giant woman named Bestla, and had 3 sons who were Odin and his brothers. So Odin is either half giant or 3/4 giant, depending on what the actual situation with the proto-gods' parentage was. And, well, that's where all the gods come from. And then Odin had it off with the earth, who is a giantess, and Ymir's separation of sexes is another interesting issue, but possibly for another time. But Odin had it off with Earth and produced Thor, who is either 3/4 or 7/8 giant. And Tyr is the son of 2 giants, 100% delicious, nutritious Etin. So basically, yes, the gods and the giants are basically the same beings, and the distinction between them, inasmuch as there is a distinction, seems to be, when there is a distinction, entirely based on range of how many people worship them and or how friendly they are to human beings. And we see a couple of examples of giant women, raised as giants, actually part of the, interfamily occasional feud, like Skadi, who comes to Asgard to avenge her father, whom the Aesir have killed, ends up going for the Wergild option, or rather the gods go for the Wergild options because they don't want any part of a duel with her, and she gets a husband out of it. She gets Njörð, and she and Njörð are incompatible in lifestyles, and they end up divorced, but she's still considered one of the goddesses, but she still lives in her father's hall in the Etin home in Jotunheimr in Giantland. She's still living there. It's listed as one of the dwellings of the gods in Grimnismal. But Skadi's fairly widely worshipped, real popular, particularly in southern, southeastern Sweden, and she may have some ties to some of the Finnish deities. We don't really know for sure. But she really, the crucial shift over is when she becomes someone who a large number of people are happy asking for help and expecting to get it on a regular basis. Whereas you see other beings like Barther, and you look at his saga, and he's pretty helpful to humans when they come to him. He teaches them law, he teaches one of the great law speakers, that kind of thing. But he doesn't really go hugely out of his way. He's a local god. He's locally worshipped, but at no point did his worship get across all of Scandinavia.
Now, I've also heard some people suggest that in general, the giants are the ones who continue to be referred to as giants, to some degree represent, the really old powers of like storm and wind and rocks and high places and, that kind of thing. And I wondered what you thought of that.
Oh, I think that's a naughty question. I think there's something to it. Now, one interesting theory in that regard is regarding Thrymskvida, where the giant Thrymr steals Thor's hammer, and much hilarity ensues as Thor dresses in drag to get it back and that. But the name Thrymr means roarer. I think it's actually related to the Thrum word. And you say, okay, we have this one sort of primal power, the roarer thunder power, who wants the hammer, gets the hammer, and then we have the later Thor the Thunderer. Not that I actually think Thor is later. My suspicion is that he's one of possibly our oldest continuously worshipped god. I can't prove it. There's no way to prove it. But I suspect it. But, you have a setup there which could very well be the more primal, the less tame, the less human-friendly, the less social power of the Proto-Thunder, kind of having this conflict with the more socialized, more beneficial our friend Thor.
So then what would be the basic difference between, say, giants and trolls? A lot of people have seen the movie Troll Hunter, and they had the image of trolls from Tolkien and stuff.
Tolkien and every tourist shop in Norway. Troll, the word's used in the Viking Age, and sometimes it's even used occasionally to refer to beings who are also referred to with the other various other giant words, and there's several of them more or less interchangeable. There's Etin, there's but in the Viking Age, when you called someone or something a troll, you weren't saying it was, a little hairy guy with a tufty tail and pointy ears who lived up in the rocks. You were just saying it was magical. In modern Scandinavian language, trolldom, or if you call someone a troll woman, you don't mean that she's got a hollow back or a tail, you mean she's a witch. Trolldom is magic. Troll started out as a generic magic word, and at some point got scooched more and more over to the class of beings which, from the descriptions, would best be described as small to medium land wights of really wild places. They never go out of their way to be excessively friendly to humans, and sometimes they'll make an aggressive start. But the interesting thing about trolls is, if you're polite to them, if you're nice to them, they're almost morally bound to be your friends, and they're very, very, very good friends. There's an Icelandic proverb, trusty as a troll, and there's a wonderful Icelandic story. This is a medieval, or slight medieval to early modern period, somewhere in there. There's a fellow called Olafur, and his village is kind of isolated, and things have happened. There's been disturbances, and they've lost the date, so they don't know when Christmas is going to be. So someone's got to go to the next village over to find out what the date is so they can celebrate Christmas properly, right? So Olafur puts on his pack and gets on his horse and starts trucking along. It's a 3 days ride, and he passes by this mountain, Blafell. And there's a big, hairy, scary, ugly, nasty-looking troll woman standing there, snarling and cussing at him. This is a dangerous road because this troll woman, Hallgerður, I think was her name, is known to live there. And, but Olafur, he's a smart fella. Instead of, drawing his sword or turning tail and running away, he greets her really politely. He says, hail and be you well, Hallgerður Blafell. And she kind of nods and, still a little bit snarky, and at some point in there hangs the name Olafur Big Mouth on him, but, she lets him pass and is reasonably polite, and he gets to the village, finds out the date, starts trucking back, and she greets him on the way back, and she's actually changed her appearance. She's much, much prettier, And she's much, much friendlier. I mean, she's a lot friendlier, and only with a little bit of difficulty is Olafur able to extract himself. And in the course of this, she asks, what are you at? What are you doing? And he explains it, and she gives him the look and says, if your Christ had done as much for us trolls as you say he's done for you humans, we'd never have forgotten his birthday.
That's a really nice kind of post-conversion story.
Yeah.
Is some of this what may come into some of the folk traditions, such as the really popular one in the Bay Area? I know it's finding out that I think it was the Norwegian or the Danish engineers working on the Bay Bridge, when they repaired it after the earthquake, they felt compelled, and they did it without permission. They built a troll face that you can only see from going underneath in a boat, but that's supposed to be protective, and apparently with bridges, you're supposed to have a troll on them.
Absolutely. If you're nice to the troll, if you respect the troll, you can't have a better friend and guardian.
You have been listening to part 1 of our interview with Kveldulfr Gundarsson here at Cat's Eye on the Future. If you would like more information on Kveldulfr, just check the show notes for episode 10 on my site, melodipsychicreadings.com. Stay tuned. We will continue with part 2 of this amazing interview right after these short messages. All the music used on the show today is from musicalley.com, your source for free-to-air music for podcasts. The artists place their music up for free to air in hopes that you, the listener, will visit their site and purchase some of their outstanding musical offerings. So after the show, why not visit musicalley.com and explore their extensive playlist?
And she sings, she goes home in the evening with the dew all on her wings.
Have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today?
And see me from beneath the sea, the best in all of Ireland. See me from beneath the sea, the best in all of Ireland.
So now that we've sort of segued into trolls and giants, maybe we can make our way back to the elves, which was kind of where we started from.
Now the elves, there's a wide and fuzzy subject, a very difficult subject. We have one strain of the elf beliefs, seems to be a fairly straightforward, spirits of the dead, who have gone into the mound, live in the local mound, do their thing in the mound, receive offerings, bless the land around. There's a bit in Cormac Saga where an animal sacrifice is made to the elves for healing. You see them called upon for healing. You see them called upon for fruitfulness. The best known example is the Norwegian king Olafur Alfr, who has the name Alf of Gerstadr, because after he dies, they put him in this mound at Gerstadr, and he continues to bless the land. People make him offerings. He's known to live there. He has become an elf. On the other hand, you have this wide range of beings that you get the impression they were never maybe all that human to begin with. Often they overlap with the land whites quite a lot. There's a huge load, a massive load of Anglo-Saxon elf terminology, elf compounds, mountain elves, sea elves, rock elves, whatever, all compounded with natural features or natural things. And, this tells you, okay, they live in these various places, they're associated with these places, and elves have a wide range of activity, which is as often unfriendly to humans as friendly. And this is a crucial thing because the elves are healers, but they're very strongly associated with causing sickness. The best known, most widely spread version, and you get this throughout the entire Germanic world, is this concept of elf shot. The idea that you get a sudden pain, a sudden sharp pain, which may be just the pain, or it may be something a lot worse that sticks with you, and that's because one of the elves has out of sheer badness shot one of their little sickness-giving arrows into you. They do this with humans. They do this with cattle. Chickenpox, with its weeping blisters, is called the water elf disease in Sweden, and I think it's suspected that it's the water elf disease that's mentioned in one of the old Icelandic medico-magical books.
Do they do this because in some cases elves are actively malicious, or is it more often because people have simply touched close to something that they should not?
Actually, it mostly seems to be sheer badness.
Okay, so we actually
They will also do horrible things if you mess with things you shouldn't. If you mess with trees that belong to them or mounds that belong to them, bad things will follow. If you're lucky, it's just your cattle that will die.
But this isn't something like Dungeons and Dragons necessarily. We have dark elves and light elves, or is it?
There's not really a clear distinction. A lot of people right now are going to be flashing on Snorri, talking about the Spark elves and the dark elves and the light elves. As best we can tell, Snorri made those terms up.
Okay. At this point, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second because I didn't do it the last time. I'd like to explain just briefly who Snorri is.
Snorri Sturluson was an Icelander, lived in the end of the 12th century through about the middle of the 13th century. He was a very well-educated man, good classical education, very politically active, quite a checkered political career, actually. Went to Norway fairly regularly. And Snorri's big hobby, Snorri was one of our first big antiquarians. His big hobby was making sure the old tales weren't forgotten. He had a great love for the art of skaldic poetry, the Norse tradition of this extremely stylized, elaborate poetry, which is primarily based on these phrases called kinnings, which are basically riddles combined with Norse mythology trivial pursuit. You could not compose or even have a hope of starting to understand a skaldic poem unless you knew a load of stuff about the gods and their relatives and their activities and their heroes. You could not even start to read a skaldic poem without that. So Snorri wrote what has probably been the most influential single book we have in modern Ausatru. It's the one that people either read first or read retellings of from first, and this is called the Younger Edda or the Prose Edda, and what Snorri wrote it as was a massive handbook of how to write skaldic poetry, but the key thing is he had to explain all of these kinnings, these riddle phases, and to do that he had to tell the stories. Sometimes happily he listed the entire skaldic poems, recounting the base tale and then translated it into prose. It's a massive work. It has some major flaws. First, he did a certain amount of cutting, snipping, and pasting to make it just a little more acceptable to the Christian morality of the time. Snorri's checkered career indicates that Christianity was not his main concern in life, but he was living in this context. Secondly, he had a good classical education, and he was trying very hard to systematize something that didn't have a system to start out with, because it was a massive oral tradition over evolved over thousands of years and a very wide geographical space indeed. So Snorri, comes up with these neat divisions, like his divisions of the light elves, dark elves, svart elves. He mentions light elfheimer, light elfheimer, and svart elfheimer. He's the only source to mention those.
And then what are those?
Light elfheimer would be the world of the light elves. Svart elfheimer would be the world of the svart elves, whom Snorri identifies with the dwarves. I'm not absolutely certain. I'd have to check. I think he chucked these in to get the count of worlds he had up to 9. Nobody else calls the dwarves black elves or dark elves or anything like that. And the dwarves don't have a world of their own. They're part of our world. There is an elfheimer. It's referred to several times in the Eddas. It's mentioned in Grimnus Mal that Freyr got the rule of Alfheimer as a tooth gift, as the present a child gets, with special present a young child gets when they grow their first tooth. So we have the world of the elves, and we have this link with Freyr, but what we don't have is this clear distinction. Now, in a practical sense, I think there is some degree of distinction. In terms of kind of mid-level otherworldly beings through the Germanic world and even other areas, other Indo-European areas like the Celtic and Greco-Roman, you get the sense of the dark elves, the mound elves, and sometimes the land wights as being more associated with the mounds, more likely to have formerly been people, and then you get the sense that there's other elves that are sort of pure energy beings. In later Scandinavian folklore, a lot of the tales of the elves are similar to the Irish Sidhe, where they've got their own communities, and you see them dancing, and it's common enough for them to abduct or occasionally come to live with human beings, mate with human beings, that sort of thing. My kind of suspicion overall, I suppose, is that there are a lot of possible subsets of elves, which are not clearly defined. I myself have been known to use the term merc elf, which is not a historical term. I made it up all by myself, as a identifier, for those who are of specifically malicious nature, specifically, associated with night darkness and doing bad stuff. But that's just me. Don't take it for lore.
And you mentioned that sometimes some of the elves seem to interact with people. Could you go into that a bit?
Yeah, this is very common. We don't, oddly enough, we don't see it in the actual Old Norse sources. I don't know that we ever lay eyes on a being described as an elf, except for Olafur, before and just on one or two occasions, briefly after his death. We don't see the humans breeding with elves. We don't see the elf dances. We don't see any of that in the actual Old Norse sources, but there's an awful lot of stuff that we don't see there. But once we get into the medieval and later folklore, we see a huge amount of it. And the elves are particularly fond of appearing to young humans of the opposite sex from the elf, who are in wild places one way or another, and seducing them. With girls in Norway particularly, the young maidens would go up in groups of, threes or fives. They'd go up to what were called the shieldings, to the high pastures where the cows would graze, and the young girls would do all the dairying work for the year. And often young male elves would appear to these girls and, abduct them for marriage, get them pregnant, whatever they did. And, if you believe your daughter coming back from the shielding and saying, it was an elf that got me in the family way, well...
It sounds like a really great excuse.
Yeah, and the other side of it was the elves and a particular type of local land wight, the forest ruler, Skolkrauet. in Sweden, the various elves, female elves, would appear particularly to male hunters. And again, that's where you get guys out in the woods pretty much on their own. Now, Skolsrauet is somewhere between a large land wight and a sort of low-level local goddess. And when you're going hunting, you want to take a bit of silver, real silver. Don't try to fob her off with any of this Cupro nickel crap. I myself have a store of old silver coins that I use for this purpose. You go into the woods and you offer her a little bit of silver for a good hunt. And if she really likes you, and if you're a guy, I have no idea what her position is on female hunters. Who knows? Maybe she's bisexual, maybe she's not. I don't know. I haven't asked. But anyway, certainly if you're a guy and you're out there by yourself and you've got a good relationship with Skolsrauet, sometimes she'll come into your cabin, and she's looking for a layover. And if you do a good job of it, this is a very good way for all your friends to think you're the world's greatest hunter. She will send you, more game than you can shake a rifle at.
I'm reminded of the old folk song about King Henry.
Very much so. Although that's more of a traditional troll story, really.
Yeah, because she changes shape.
Yeah, she changes shape and she's not really, there to, her object is not to, help him hunt or manage the game. The King Henry story is probably more reminiscent of the troll stories, and it's much closer. I think it's probably descended from the Celtic Loathly Bride. And the Celtic Loathly Bride is the classic, goes all the way back to Niall of the Nine Hostages. I think it was one of the great Irish kings. Finds the old hag, but he's a courteous guy, so he sits down and he eats, I guess not boiled potato peels in those days, but whatever the equivalent was, and he's polite and courteous, and she makes a move on him, and he's polite and courteous and goes for it, even though she's, disgusting and revolting and 98 years old. He does it anyway because he's a polite guy. And then he wakes up in the morning and she's the most beautiful thing ever seen. And what she is the sovereignty of the land. She's the embodiment of the land who, was old and withered, and then the king comes to her and treats her right. And suddenly she's spectacularly beautiful, and not to miss out on subtle points, the embodiment of his right to rule the land.
Is there anything like that in the Germanic, or is that primarily a Celtic motif?
That particular form is a Celtic motif, but there may have been a very similar sort of thing going on with the Yngling kings in Freya. There's, the Ynglings were the dynasty who ruled in Sweden through the migration and Vendel Age, and then stuff happened and they had to move on to Norway and got into the Norwegian royal line. But the Ynglings the name suggests that they're descended from Freyr, whose original name was Ingvaz Ingvi. Freyr is just a title meaning lord, but it had largely overtaken the original first name in the Norse. And they're of this dynasty, and the poem which describes mostly their deeds and deaths and burials has a huge number that really give the impression of being offerings to Freya. There's one of them is hanged with a gold necklace by his own wife. One of them is riding his horse around the halls at the feast of the Disir of the family ancestresses or goddesses, and breaks his head against a stone, which is attributed to the doings of, quote, a witch, unquote, but it is an offering, more or less by the actions of a mighty female being at the festival of mighty female beings in Freyr and Freya's own holy place. So there is this strong suspicion that there may have been some kind of marriage with Freya associated with the power and the right of the Ynglings.
Now, you mentioned the ancestors. I think it's a very good way to segue in both to ancestor veneration in Germanic stuff And given the time of year, the idea of ghosts.
Yes, because you know, as should be clear by now, you can't. There's not really that clear dividing line between the dead and anything you like to name, pretty much in the other world. And our forebears were big believers in the dead still hanging around. One of the most important aspects of that was the cult of the Deseer. Now, the word Dece is an interesting word. It can be applied from anyone, from a live noblewoman to one of the, when you hear it collectively, it's the plural Deseer. It's usually referring collectively to the active female ancestresses who guide their descendants, pick them up when they die, that kind of thing. It can be applied to a goddess. It can be applied to indicate that a woman is related to a man. For instance, Hel is called Narvi's Dece. She is the sister of Narvi, who's one of Loki's other kids. So it's a very general word meaning woman of power, but the most specific use that we get is this belief in the troop of female ancestors who will talk to a man or sometimes to his wife in their dreams. And it's not uncommon for women to receive prophetic, inspirational, or otherworldly communications for their husbands, because the Norse seem to have this belief that women were just a little bit better at receptive psychic stuff than men. And they come in dreams to give warnings, they come in dreams to give advice, they come in dreams to say you're gonna die now.
So would ancestors and possibly ghosts, or basically the departed, be one of the major ways that people receive divinatory information in the Germanic period?
Very much so. There's a term, Thule, English version Thule, Norse version Thorn-ul. And this word implies inspired speech. One of Odin's titles is Fimbulthulr, the Great Thule. It's seems to be, in its various renditions, a word implying verbal inspiration. It also appears in the Anglo-Saxon in a more secular context, where Unferth, who does the verbal challenging of Beowulf, is Thule in Hrothgar's Hall, and it implies that his primary function is verbal, but the other uses of the term imply inspiration. In Havamal, I believe Odin talks about sitting on the Thule's chair at the Well of Weird, when it is time for great things to be talked about and decided. And he sits down on the Thule's chair because it's time for him to speak, to say mighty words, to pass them on. We also have a runic inscription, which is particularly telling because it's a memorial to this guy who was Thule on the burial mounds at Sal, at this particular place in Denmark. And the act of being a Thule was associated, we see from this, very much with sitting officially on the mounds of the dead. Now, where we also see this sitting on the mounds of the dead to receive inspiration, this was commonly done by kings. There's actually a proverb to sit like a king on a burial mound. And by that, doing so, the king, not only reaffirmed his legitimacy because it was presumably one of his ancestors, and possibly a fairly recent one under him, but he's also going out, sitting alone in a high place to open up so that the dead can speak through him, so the dead can inspire him. So the dead can advise him.
So basically the Norse are practicing what, again, in a modern sense might be considered mediumship.
Yeah, and that's also where you get poetry from. People think poetry, mead, gift of Odin, which is true, but when you look at where Odin got it, that means brewed by dwarves, which are creatures strongly associated with death, dissolution, and death, are also very much dead people themselves. You can tell because they've got names like Dain, the dead one, gnawing corpse. That's a hint, right? It's brewed by dwarves from the heart's blood of a murdered man. It's kept underground. Odin has to become a snake, which is another creature of death, to get it. And we also get more direct descriptions, such as the skaldic poem just post-conversion, where a guy is saying, I never got Odin's booty, Odin's gain, the meat of poetry, sitting under the hanged. People would actually presumably go out and sit under dead men so that Odin, through the hanging corpse, would in some way infuse them with this meat of poetry.
Well, some of this, I actually was thinking when you were talking about sitting on the mound, there's similar things in the Irish legends of going and sitting on the ancient mounds, and if you spent the night, you would either come back mad or the very best of bards. And it's reported that traditionally that O'Carolan, the last of the great historical bards, I think it was 17th, 18th century, went up onto the mound and did this and came back and, of course, became a very, very famous composer of a lot of the traditional Irish music we have today. And again, but I think, these were also, they were ancient burial mounds.
Yes.
So it's that idea of going and getting inspiration. It seems to, again, be another one of those hints of, at least not an original source, but at least contact between the Norse and the Celts.
Yeah, contact or possibly something that goes back to deeper Indo-European roots. I'd be hard put to it to distinguish between the two, because honestly the idea of getting inspiration directly from the dead is something that's pretty common universally. Now,
at this point, I would love to have you tell some traditional ghost stories, but I think maybe because it's getting a little late, we'll save that for perhaps if we can have another meeting in October. But I think there's one group of beings I know we haven't touched on, and I may have missed somebody else as well. But if you could talk a little bit about the gods, I think.
Okay, the gods. What are the gods and where do they come from? Well, a few of them, we know their pedigrees pretty clearly. We know most of Odin's. We know Thor's. That's pretty distinctive. We know Tyr's, son of the Etin Hymir and his wife, who's also an Etin. A lot of the gods, we don't really know where they came from. We have no pedigree for Frigg, except that she's related to a guy by the name of Fjorgen, who may or may not be an earlier form of Thor, an earlier thunder god. The name's cognate to Perkunus, and the Baltic peoples picked it up as the Goths passed through, probably, since the name's also apparently known in some form in the Gothic language. But most of the gods, their origins are a little mysterious. We have this whole group of deities called the Vanir, about whom we know they tend to be associated with fruitfulness. We have Freyr and Njörður, who were sent as hostages to the Aesir, and Freya, who just sort of turned up on her own. And this was after a big war between the two of them. We don't know where the Vanir came from. We have not one word about their origins. Now, coincidentally, we also don't know where Aldumla, Ymir's cow, went after Ymir died, and there's a lot of cattle imagery in the Vanic cults here and there. So my suspicion has always been that one way or another they came from Aldumla and genuinely represent a different strain. But you might ask the question, what is a god? What distinguishes the gods from other beings? And I think the only answer there really is to that is they get worshipped like a god, and they more or less act like a god. If you're worshipped, if you're honored by enough people, possibly over locally enough people, you become a local deity, possibly over a wider area, all the way up to Odin, and Frigg and Thor, who were known all over the Germanic world. but you get your worship and you give people your blessings or not if they annoy you enough. And they start thinking of you as a god, describing you as a god. And we actually have a fairly clear example of one human who somehow made this transition. And this was a poet, a Viking Age poet, early 9th century, name of Bragi the Old. It is generally agreed that this poet is in fact the same as the god Bragi described in Locusenna and in Snorri's Prose Edda. And at some point in there, he was taken up among the gods. We see other heroes who are just a little smidgen of a step below that. Sigmundr and Sinfjotli seem to have, the kind of main gate guard duty in Valhalla, at least according to the poetry of the 10th century. There's indications that Theodoric the Great may have gotten a certain degree of worship even in Scandinavia. So there is this spectrum thing going on here.
So what is this idea that I've heard that, all warriors go to Valhalla, and if you don't die in battle, you will somehow go to Hela's realm in the underworld, which is...
That would be Snorri somewhere between systematizing and Christianizing. Snorri made it up.
So basically, people seem to have a lot of choices, at least in the...
People have a lot of choices. when you die, you can stay in your mound to become a benevolent local whatever, local elf, housewife if you're more associated with the family than the land. You can just live on in there doing your own thing and not really interacting with the people in the land around you much. Some families have their own rocks or mountains that they all go into and party collectively in. There's one family in Iceland in Eyrbyggja's saga particularly noted for this. Some people just, sort of hang out in their burial mounds. Some people are a little more stubborn and come wandering back. There's one guy in Greta's saga who comes back as a nasty broider, but his sole goal is to extend his son's grip over the entire area. He's actually somewhere between a friendly elf, at least to his son, and a horrifying monster. But then you can you can go to the hall of the god to whom you're closest, the hall of the god who's closest to you, and we get descriptions of Odin himself swooping up one of Eilf's sons who had actually died of a fever, of carrying him up and off. Again, we see Odin picking up Sinfjotli in his boat, and Sinfjotli died of poison, but hey, there he is in Valhalla doing gate greeting duty.
And do people ever come back?
Yes. In fact, reincarnation was, in one form or another, one of the more persistent ideas. There's sometimes it's being reborn in the family line. Sometimes it seems to go with the name alone, as in Helgi of the Helgi cycle of poems, and Helgi's interesting because he has his first life along with the woman who is his, sort of soulmate, female other half, whatever. They're born, they meet, he gets killed mainly because of what he's gone through to get her. So she dies. Then they're reborn to people who, as far as we know, are not related to them, but the name carries enough power to carry him through, and he's pretty much the same thing happens, rinse and repeat. They meet, he fights for her, kills some family members, her younger brother kills him, and then first Helgi goes to Valhalla. Then he's seen late in the evenings, riding back to his barrow mound every evening once the fighting in Valhalla is over, bugs out of the partying early, who knows, rides down to his mound, and his number two rendition of his female other half comes to him in the mound. They spend a lovely night together, though one wouldn't want to ask too closely about any of the details. But anyway, it spends the night in the mound, And after that, he rides back to Ballhooks in the morning, but then they're both reborn again.
Right. So we have all of these different possibilities. This has been really, really fascinating. I do want to point out that if you're interested in more information on this, I believe you have a book out.
Yes, the book is entitled Elves, Wights, and Trolls. It is available on Amazon. It goes into the various tales and the explorations that have been done of the natures of these different beings, of how they act. There's a fair amount of practical information in there as well. It's drawn about equally from the Old Norse corpus of literature and archaeology, and the later folklore, which is, of course, incredibly rich in tales about these beings, and even more to the point in the little practicalities of how to deal with them. And you want to watch it because a lot of this is similar to the Celtic stuff, which is better known, but sometimes it's not. If a Celtic being, if one of the Sidhe offers you, invites you into their home and offers you something to eat or drink, you don't want to do that. That's really not a good idea at all. If a Norse wight does the same, refusing it is bad manners. Bad things will happen. Maybe the worst that will happen is that you will fail to receive the awesome gift that they were trying to bestow on you, but more often they're going to get torqued off and you won't like what happens then. On the other hand, to make it even trickier, you want to be careful about drinking something a troll offers you, because it's like 550 proof and will turn you into a little pile of ash.
Well, that's a great lead-in as to why everyone should go out and get this book. And like I said, it's available on Amazon. This has just been fascinating, and I'm really hoping we can make it work in October, because I'd really love to hear. I know some of the specific stories and some of the nice, creepy stuff that's related to this, but isn't quite on enough time for it this evening. So I'd like to thank you so much for being with us, and look forward to seeing you again. I was
delighted to do this, and as many people know very well, my doctoral thesis was entitled The Cult of Odin, God of Death, so I shall be delighted to return in October with a full hour of Norse creepy.
We'll see you then. Good night, everyone.
But here's a health to the company, and one to my lass.
You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a glimpse of the energies coming soon into your world and into your future. Be sure to join us again next time when we explore another chapter of Cat's Eye on the Future.
Again. But here's a health to the company, and one to my lass. Let us drink and be merry, all out of one glass. Let us drink and be